Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back for our first afternoon panel discussion today. It's a topic which, for those who have been watching throughout, and particularly watching the McKinsey presentation and report from this morning, it has very much been front and center of today's discussion, which is expediting translation of innovation and discussing evolving business models for academia, industry, and investment partnerships to get innovation from the Nordic ecosystem into companies more quickly. We have expertise and experience both from the region, but also from outside the region for today's discussion. So really looking forward to this one. Please do keep your questions and your comments coming through on the chat function. Again, bottom right of your screen, there's the chat and questions function. So please do post in there, and we'll get to all of those questions as they come through throughout the panel and at the end. But delighted now to be handing over to our moderator for today's discussion, Bobby Sonny, Chief Business Officer with the BII. So Bobby, over to you.
Wonderful, thank you, Josh. Yes, hello everyone, and welcome to the session on expediting the translation of innovation, evolving business models. So clearly this is a topic that's close to all of our panelists' hearts. What I'd like to do now is have the panelists introduce themselves, and I'll introduce myself last, and then we'll take it from there. So if we take top right on my screen, I'll ask Clementina to introduce herself, please.
Hi everyone, Clementina Österberg. I'm the CEO of G Ventures, a Gothenburg-based incubator and seed investor, and we're 100% owned by the Swedish state. Is that okay?
Wonderful, thank you. And Richard?
Hi everyone, pleasure to be here. So I'm Richard Reschen. I'm part of the European Business Development and Licensing team of MSD, so based in London.
Thank you. Magnus?
Yep, hi everyone, Magnus Björstner. I'm heading up the AstraZeneca BioVenture Hub in Gothenburg, and prior to that I spent some 10 years in business development on behalf of AstraZeneca.
Wonderful. And lastly, Jonathan Tobin.
Hi, I'm Jonathan Tobin. I'm an investment director with Brandon Capital Partners, which is an Australian-based venture firm with about $800 million under management that specializes in early stage biotech and company creation. And I'm based in London.
Wonderful, welcome. And my name is Bobby Sonny. I'm the Chief Business Officer of the Bioinnovation Institute based in Copenhagen. We are an innovation institute funded by the Novo Nordics Foundation with 470 million euros. And our mission is to translate science into great products for the benefit of people and society. And we do that by funding companies here at the BII. So it's a pleasure that you're all here. And what I'd like to do is actually, before I start, Magnus, if you could provide a little bit of background on what BioVentures is, or what your organization does, because I think it's the one that's maybe not as clear to everyone.
Yeah, so in essence, what we asked ourselves a couple of years back whether we could find a model where we would basically share human capital residing in big pharma with scale-up companies. So we have, in collaboration with the Swedish government, created this entity, which is a non-for-profit subsidiary of AstraZeneca. And we have some 40 external companies that over the years have moved in to co-locate inside our R&D unit in Sweden. It's an ambition. It's not about startups. It's actually focused on scale-up companies. And it covers the sectors of diagnostic, ICT, medtech, and pharma. So it's all about sector convergence in order to catalyze innovation, basically.
Wonderful, thank you. So with that in mind, what I'd like to do is take a deal taker based approach into the discussion here. It's something that's very dear to our hearts at the BII, and that everything we start should have an end in the market, and that end is someone taking on the project and funding it and taking the next steps. So with that, I'd like to ask Jonathan, for example, if you look at the deal flow that you're looking at in the Nordic market, what are the pros and cons of that deal flow with regards to investability or fundability, teams, and how does that compare with other regions?
So I guess first point would be that I think very early stage investors that are doing company creation, I wouldn't necessarily class as deal takers, because I think the investor themselves is often functioning as a co-founder, or at least having a very big hand in creating an opportunity with an innovator or an entrepreneur. And so I would say deal flow often is something that the investor sort of needs to kind of cultivate. It's a long-term process of getting to know the ecosystem. And I think from my experience of having done 2 companies in Denmark, which both originated from your shop at the BII, it's been super straightforward to do business as an investor, very transparent, easy to work with. I think the key thing for me has been sort of early engagement with companies, or even before their companies, seeking feedback, and kind of staying abreast of ideas until they're actually really suitable for investment. And that's been, I think, a really nice feature of it.
Very good, thank you. So if we can ask from the industry viewpoint, Richard, are you seeing enough deals, and are they, and maybe I speak on behalf of many of our participants here, is it always too early?
Thanks, Bobby. I think, yeah, there's a lot of good companies and good things happening in the Nordics. So I don't think we see any particular difference compared to other regions. I mean, the key thing that we always look for, is good science, and we're geographic kind of agnostic, so wherever that is. So we never really kind of, I suppose, consider things on a geographic aspect. I mean, I think across Europe, we come across sometimes companies that may have great science, but perhaps are a little earlier in their understanding of what types of experiments, for example, pharma might like to see before it come to a point at which we may be interested in some kind of transaction with them. So I don't think that's specific to the Nordics. I think we see that across Europe, and that's just occasionally that happens to be the case. I think perhaps sometimes in the Nordics, a lot of companies tend to list quite early on the stock market, and perhaps that means that they don't always get the benefit of working with experienced investors and kind of getting the development advice that they can offer. So that's perhaps the only kind of aspect I would perhaps see it's specific to the Nordics. But otherwise, for us, we see kind of good deal flow. We see kind of excellent companies in that area, lots of great universities. So an exciting region to look for new science in.
Okay, very good. Thank you, Richard. And I think that you said something really interesting there, which is about the early listing and choosing that funding approach versus a institutional investor approach. So maybe Clementina, you can comment here.
I would love to.
I know GU has had a history of doing lots of early small IPOs. Is that better than working with VCs, or are there just not enough VCs like Jonathan that want to work that early? So what's driving the dynamic?
Yeah, it's a good question, because I wouldn't say it's better or worse. Just to give you some numbers, we have started around 220 companies. Out of those, around 140 are in operation today. And those companies that we have, built and advanced, 10% of them are on the stock exchange, while there's 90% has other capital, VC or family offices or business angels financing them. But to answer it, yes, it's a wonderful situation in Sweden that we can actually list these companies in the early stage. I wouldn't say they lack the competence, because it's very important that their board and other advisors and consultants that they work with have these sort of, like you said, the competence that maybe a VC investor would bring in. So we make sure that the board of directors have that competence, as well as the teams. Then, of course, it's also, I guess, that it's a bit lacking financing in Sweden, in that perspective that we haven't had that much life science investors on the VC side. HealthCap has been not alone all the time, but for many years it's only been HealthCap that had invested in these companies. So for instance, we have like a couple of 100 contacts in Europe, and we work with international VCs as well, and it's so important to attract that international capital here to Sweden, to our Swedish companies, because I agree with Richard. I think we have great ideas and great universities.
Wonderful. Okay, so
Bobby, just
go ahead,
a comment which may be relevant here. Vinnova, the Swedish Innovation Agency, is actually funding a doctoral thesis on the topic whether early listing in life science is bad or good. So it's a huge investigation going back some 20 years where they are looking into companies that choose and they are comparing VC funding with IPOs. And I think the first papers will start to come out within short, and that will be very, very interesting to see. Because I think it's like religion, dependent on who you speak to, it's either good or bad.
Yeah, exactly.
There's a very similar analog in Australia where a lot of biotechs historically have listed very early because that's just where capital's available. And I guess in the UK in the old days, that was the same thing. And so companies will go where capital is most readily available. And I guess the cost of capital is the best. So whether it's good or bad, I suppose, is an interesting question, but having money is kind of essential. So
yeah.
And maybe I can just add, I suppose, maybe not kind of, I wasn't particularly saying it's good or bad. I think maybe what it comes down to, I don't know whether the other panelists agree, is the kind of local expertise available to kind of guide the companies at the early stage. And perhaps that's the most important thing rather than the source of money.
Yeah.
You know, and sometimes obviously VC money may come with that and maybe a listing may or may not. So it really depends on who the company has, you know, to talk to. And we certainly would always encourage kind of early interactions with pharma, with VCs, with other parties.
Yeah.
You know, just to really understand kind of what kind of downstream companies such as ourselves are kind of looking for in kind of early stage biotechs.
I think that's a really good point because companies that tend to list early often don't have the sort of management that VCs would think were backable. And I think some of the really good companies, particularly in the States, that raise a lot of money early on are ones that are led by an experienced entrepreneur or industry veteran who has made a relationship with the innovating academic and is the front face of the new opportunity rather than a university academic being the front face of the opportunity. And there's a huge difference in external perception when there's somebody like that. I mean, I remember, Bobby, when we were involved in starting Artios, the thing had no data at all. I mean, any normal investor would have said it was too early. And yet, because you had the person who'd invented a blockbuster drug as the CEO, which is so unusual in Europe, the company, rather than doing a seed round, ended up raising a very, very oversubscribed Series A with basically no data. And obviously, those individuals are very, very scarce. But I think when an academic has made the effort to do the networking with an entrepreneur, their probability of success at raising money is exponentially higher.
I agree totally with Jonathan, and I would just like to say that I don't think we have any company where we have the academics as management. Maybe they are part-time CTO, CSO sort of persons, but it's really important that you have, like you said, industry veterans or other type of entrepreneurs. And actually, mostly we have industry veterans in these companies that we list. And so does a lot of other people in Sweden. So I would say that the academic stay in the academy.
What I've seen a lot of is the investors they do a small seed round based around an academic and then try and hire in management. And you get a very different phenotype of person, more like a hired middle manager in that situation than you do if it's actually an entrepreneur that's raising the money de novo.
Wonderful. And I'd like to wrap this up. So actually, as we talked about before, the Swedish listing or the early stage listing is religion, or there are very strong viewpoints. I think we at the BII also have a strong viewpoint, and we have the opposite one, which is we don't believe that the early listing is an appropriate solution for very early stage companies, precisely because they lose out on that early engagement with pharma or with industry and VC and that which can be helpful to them. So,
but why do you believe that? Why do you think we don't have any contact?
Just the numbers. Just I think the pitch that I heard from several investment bankers that we talked to was, you can't raise a lot of money. On the other hand, the valuation is really low. So as a sponsor, as an advocate for our founders in trying to get them the best possible solution to bringing their companies forward, it simply hasn't been an attractive solution compared. And I think maybe this is the key, as Jonathan said before, Jonathan and investors like him are willing to work early and invest the money, but there's not a lot of them. So we've worked very hard in cultivating relationships with a whole network of investors that are willing to do it and do show an interest in working with the companies.
I mean, in my experience, Bobby, I share your view, and I think this is partly it's a contact sport what we do. So proximity is important, and proximity to investors is important. But on the other hand, I would say good assets will find good investors. It is that simple. So I think
wherever they are.
Yeah, wherever they are. So rather than discussing where the money comes from, how do we secure that we have a pipeline of opportunities that is attractive, irrespectively of funding source?
And wonderful, I'm glad you mentioned. I'm going to pick up on that, which is, and I'll talk to our Richard and Jonathan. So we've had the premise here from Clementina and Magnus, and it seems like you're both agreeing that tech wins always, and tech finds investors. I would ask the question to Jonathan and Richard: to what extent does team versus tech play a role in your investment decisions, and to what extent are you seeing teams or tech that you don't invest in because the team isn't there? So what's the dynamic in your hands?
I think the technology is necessary but not sufficient. I mean, sometimes at the early stage, it's hard to convince a lot of people that it is amazing. Sometimes, I mean, I'm looking at a deal at the moment where the technology is amazing and the people are very, very expert at their particular technology, but commercially and sort of on a corporate basis are completely clueless. But that's okay. I mean, because you can bring in professionals around them. But I would say that you have to have, at the very least, a team or a person who is a world leader on their subject and has all of the answers at their fingertips. You can't back somebody, even an academic, who's not, top decile.
Very good.
And then I suppose from our point of view, I mean, science is always key for us. So the science has to be good, and the science is what drives things. I think obviously it's great to see a good team around it. I mean, I think as a minimum, I suppose you need people, as Jonathan says, that really understand the science and are also good at reaching out. To reach out to pharma, reach out to VCs, etc. But for us, the science, I suppose, comes first. If the science is good, perhaps there's ways to work around it. If a team is not ideal, so I think that's kind of probably our view on that.
My view is that sometimes we as investors, maybe in pharma it's a bit different, but we see ourselves as being completely data driven, like machines that can process perfect information, the science. But I think a lot of the time it's, investors make decisions based on kind of gestalt and gut feel and, who else is involved, social proof, all of those things. And the fact is that, we're human beings, so that's kind of how we operate. And so while the science is important, it's just one of the pieces of the puzzle. And I mean, that's just true.
But Jonathan, I think that there is a difference, from the investor perspective versus the partner perspective, because if you sit on the amount of resources that the company like MSD or AZ or Novo is doing, you can always add resources that is lacking, provided the science is robust.
Yeah.
But you have to live with the team and the tech you get, and you can add some things to it. So I think there is a difference.
You can actually fire people, I guess.
No, I think, and I think what we're highlighting here, that if one is to create a sustainable, investable company, team's important.
Yes.
Yeah.
But if your goal
it's not just team though, Bobby, it's the whole story.
Yeah.
It's the whole, it's even like the reputation. It's, investors that gossip to each other about, oh, don't look at that company, it's rubbish. It actually might not be rubbish. But the whole presentation of an opportunity, I think, is super important. There are deals which I scratch my head looking at that are extremely oversubscribed and everyone, you know, is clamoring with FOMO to get into them, and vice versa. And, you know, I think the interesting thing about early stage biotech is that you can be quite contrarian, and there are no right or wrong answers, because often it's too early to tell. And the course that the technology goes, and even the market goes, is unpredictable. And often, I mean, you've seen that recently with, like, you know, mRNA. There'll be a technology that's pretty niche and suddenly is like big time. And that's often when, you know, those unpredictable events, everyone thinks they were geniuses for picking them in the first place, but there's a hell of a lot of kind of serendipity there as well.
Yeah. I'm going to pick up on that topic and maybe put a pin in it with regard to presentation. I think we recognize that at the BII, and we put all of our cohorts on a sort of roadshow, talking to 20, 30 investors within their first year, where we observe and then we give them feedback. And the mantra to our companies are, if an investor doesn't understand what you're saying, that's your problem. That's not the investor. You haven't communicated it well enough. And that sort of goes back to the necessary but sufficient. The tech is there, the people are there, but you need to have the right communication around it. I want to switch tack a little bit and talk about industry involvement in early stage science, and maybe talk about AstraZeneca's approach versus MSD's here. So, Magnus, you made a decision. I remember when I was at Seeds, we had this initial discussion around what you're creating at AstraZeneca and this co-localization of pharma and science. Can you talk a little bit about what was the pull from AstraZeneca? What was the desire from AstraZeneca to do it? Or was it maybe because there was some space available and this was a good opportunity to use the space in a productive way? So what was the dynamics there?
The dynamics were very interesting. So I mean, it started off with, as you say, the fact that we were consolidating R&D both in UK, US, and Sweden. There was space made available. So in Boston, we created a biohub that basically is about allowing companies to use the infrastructure at AstraZeneca. And there is the real estate market in Boston is very different from the one in the Nordics. And in UK, we choose to collaborate with a company that basically has as a business model to drive science parks. But in Sweden, we realize that it's different. Real estate is not the bottleneck here. It's rather access to knowledge. So what we wanted to do here was, again, I mean, could we find a mechanism that would expose AstraZeneca to not the typical science we are looking at, but rather what we will need tomorrow? And if we all know that the interplay between industry verticals that are not used to collaborate. And when I was in business development, I remember we were in discussions with IT companies, and it's quite easy to add them on as add-ons to an innovation or a product. But if we talk about joint innovation with these type of companies, the business logic doesn't marry. So we needed to find a new way to interact with companies who, when we tell them it's 8 years to market, they shouldn't walk away. And we all know that IT will probably be obsolete in 3 years. So how should we co-innovate with these type of companies? And that was the driver behind the BioVenture Hub. So it's really all about Horizon 2 and Horizon 3. So we are bringing in gaming companies. We are bringing in quantum computing. It's all those things where BD normally would say it's too early. And what really triggered me, Bobby, when we started this was the fact that when I was in BD, you very often encountered very nice companies where you realize that this is super sexy, but you couldn't really predict what it should result in. That means you can't build your business case and you can't get management to support it. But the realization was that everything we don't understand, we say no to. And I think if we should be in the forefront of innovation, and especially disruptive innovation, we can't have that approach as a company. So the BioHub is all about exposing us to the stuff we normally would have said no to, but where we intuitively thought, why, this is interesting. So it's a very different approach, I think. And I think it has been recognized for being different. And to me, this all boils down to what are the mechanisms that we jointly can provide to support growth among these companies. And I think investors have one role, pharma has another role, and I mean, there's a lot of stakeholders, and the key question to me is how we should join up. I mean, both from industry, from the investor perspective. I mean, BII do the same, but also with a slight different touch.
Yeah.
And I think if we could collaborate in a better way in how we provide that support, that's what these companies needs.
Yeah. So, and I'll maybe add some context here. I think Jonathan and I, when we were both in Imperial Innovations, we were at the group one of the groups that formed Apollo Therapeutics, where AstraZeneca is a key stakeholder and investor. So that was a consortium of 3 pharma companies working with 3 universities in order to bridge gaps in translation of science. And they've had their first period, and they've moved on and raised money as an independent company now to bring those projects forward. So far, so good. It is challenging, however, when pharmaceutical companies are working that early, bringing a large company mindset. So I guess my question for Magnus, and we'll go to Richard, is what does that interaction look like at the BioHub? Is this rental space where companies come in, or is there a value add with AstraZeneca?
So the setup is basically that, yes, there is a rental space, and it is at market rent. And since there is no market to compare with, I think it's quite favorable if you're a small company, because we don't do this as a means to get the revenue. And then what we offer the teams is since this is partly funded by tax money, we have to be a bit cautious about what type of support we provide, because we can't compete with the private market when it comes to what a consultancy firm or a CRO is providing. But it's a lot about, I will give you some examples. We have companies who have met our ad boards in, for example, oncology, to discuss the whole clinical plan. That is a team of pharmacists, developers, IP people, cross pharma, something that company wouldn't be able to access irrespective of what funding they had. We have made formulations for companies with our formulation team to help them do the right formulation when they move into development, rather than redoing trials at the later stage. So it's that type of industry expertise. Yeah. We don't help them with business development. We don't help them with IP. It's pure tech support.
So it's early engagement on the project.
Yeah. And no boundaries, because I think one very important aspect of this is that we are actually avoiding to bring in companies that has products that are of interest to us. And this may sound a bit stupid, but it had really turned out to be one of the success factors, because that is what promotes the openness we have created. So the lens we are looking at is there competence and technology of relevance? And it's ideal if the product is of non-relevance, because then we can truly interact.
Yeah, very good. So Richard, I'll ask you to a follow-up on that, and then we're going to move on to the topic of how companies can make themselves attractive to investors and accelerators and different IP setups. But Richard, so what is MSD doing to sort of work with early stage companies that are too early for MSD? Are there any product offerings, or has that even been a thought at your organization?
Yes, I mean, I think there are different ways of doing it, and some of the ways we've approached. I mean, firstly, we have our own ventures fund, so MRL Ventures, which invests in kind of early stage preclinical companies that maybe are too early or kind of too innovative for BD&L, where perhaps it's something, as Magnus has said, it's a bit out there. So we have that mechanism. Another one we've taken is we've set up kind of hubs in some of the kind of the key biotech kind of areas. So we have one in Boston, one in San Francisco, and now in London. So just an example, in London, we are actually integrated into both LBIC and the Crick Institute, where, for example, we support postdocs. We have a science team in London, which is focused on neuroscience, but is focused on the very innovative end of that, and is doing quite a lot of kind of collaborations kind of locally. So I think we've positioned ourselves at the moment in these kind of 3 locations because of the kind of ecosystems there, and we really seek to integrate ourselves into those ecosystems. And for example, the Exploratory Science Centre in Cambridge and Boston, it's almost run like a biotech, so it has its own budget and decision making, and seeks to do kind of very kind of innovative and early stage projects in kind of technology areas or kind of therapeutic areas that we might not, in the more traditional BD&L end, be yet ready to kind of partner in. So, but I think there's a whole range of kind of models out there, some really exciting things that are going on. I worked previously at Oxford. We had, Oxford there had a different model, for example, of working with industry. So I think, it's important to kind of look at all these different models and kind of over time, I suppose, see what seems to be the best at encouraging innovation. But definitely, I think is all working together and trying to kind of contribute as much as possible early on to the development of early stage companies, and just interacting with them is probably really helpful.
Wonderful, thank you. If I can make maybe a plea to the industry representatives out there. In our experience, my experience as an investor, I think Jonathan will share this, corporate venture funds have actually played an enormously important part in working with early stage science, where they are and maturing them as equal partners with institutional funds to get things to a point where they can mature into great companies. And I wonder to what extent large pharma industry has taken that on board as a strategic tool in their toolbox. Some have, some haven't, but something to consider. So we have a question here from the audience, which is, how can early stage projects and companies make themselves attractive as possible to funders and accelerators? So maybe we should take this in the order of where they might meet us. And if we start with Clementina first, for example.
Great, thanks. Well, if they mean that early stage project, I mean, we mentioned all the above. We need to make them interesting from the science level, attractive in the team, in the board. We need to have that sort of service provider around them, just like the AstraZeneca BioVenture Hub or other type of hubs that, have all the other collaborational parts. We also need to make them attractive in how they present their story, just like Jonathan said in the beginning. And we need to have great funding that can meet the plan, so we can get the milestones we need. And how we make them attractive to funders is if they have a really interesting science as well as a commercial plan. So it needs to go hand in hand. Many of the companies, like you mentioned before, might not have had that help. But that's why we have the ecosystem within the innovation part, where both the universities have their sort of innovation offices and technology transfer units, to coming out with where the holding companies like ourselves work with incubators, as well as partnering early, meeting the industry. So for instance, we always get our companies to visit BioEurope and sort of those type of meetings where they can meet pharma in a very early stage. It's very important to get the feedback and also meet investors in the early stage. What type of commercial plan would be interesting in the end? That's what I would say.
Wonderful, thank you, Clementina. And if I can add, as the BIIs almost a step before any of this, because we will take on projects that have no data, because essentially we are very founder-centric, and the key element for us is, does the science or the idea represent a fundable concept? If this works, will it raise future funding? And there's lots of projects that meet unmet needs, great unmet needs, but not all of that is fundable. And so we respect the market, and we work within what the market can work with. That's one of our criteria. And the second one is the founder able to understand the founder's role in the success of the company? So we very much spend time thinking about training the founders in what a good founder is, and what their role is with regards to science, team, and commercial. So how does the science need to develop? What team needs to be put around the founder? So all of the founders are absolutely required, but insufficient for success. So without having an understanding of what more is required, we're not interested, without understanding that that's important, we're not interested.
So Bobby, may I ask you a question? Because it was a couple of years since I left the licensing world. But as I think, if you look into the portfolio today, I think there are 1,300 oncology products in development, and there is a couple of more thousand in discovery. And I think if you look on many of the incubator portfolios, I would say roughly 50% of companies are oncology programs, and the other 30% is orphan disease. And if you look on the density of those two sectors and compare that with the strategy of big pharma today, I think there you have one answer why we don't see a lot of partnerships, because the assets that are being developed in the SMEs is not really aligned to the needs of industry And if you look on the trends in industry today, I don't think we have one single product in AstraZeneca without the digital component in it.
Right.
And this is alien to all these small companies. They are still stuck in the traditional pharma way of doing it, and they do it in areas where they can fund themselves, which means that we are not interested. So I think a very important discussion here is openness from industry with respect to what is our interest of tomorrow.
Right. Very good. Yeah. So before you're opening up for another very important discussion, which is the role of digital health and other.
No, it's really about the relevance of the early portfolio in the biotech community.
So let me answer that with regards to how we look at it, and then why don't we go on to Jonathan and ask how companies can make themselves attractive to his fund. We very much screen all of our deal flow via our own diligence, but also via VCs and industry. So we ask right up front, is this of interest? Could this be of interest at one point? So we're trying to be exit led right from the beginning. So if the fundamentals are in place and the industry is asking for it, that's the point we start to get involved.
So I don't question the fact that somebody's funding all those 1,300 oncology trials, but is it relevant? I mean, if you could deal with compliance, that is probably worth more to society than yet another drug. So I mean, do we spend our effort in the right space?
and that's a very large question, Magnus. I don't know if this. Sorry. I know we have great people here, but that's one for our creator almost.
I think you've done a good job, Bobby, with the BII. I think partly, because you've got a venture background, so you've got that kind of way of thinking about things. I think a lot of incubators, accelerators, etc., they don't have that kind of venture experience on the team, and maybe think about things more like a sort of tech transfer office thinks about things. And there's quite a big difference, actually. And so, I think that's definitely a strength of the kind of outfit that you're building there. And maybe more people should who are doing that sort of incubator model should copy that to get people that have venture experience in their team as part of their process.
That's a good recommendation. I agree with you. I think that many of our employees are actually from the pharma industry and haven't done so much venture projects, actually.
And they're not all terrible people.
No, they're great people.
And to my former venture colleagues that are listening, I'm sorry, that was an easy joke. Jonathan, maybe you want to talk about what makes a case interesting to you? What are the key drivers?
For me, it's got to be a big idea, which I think is going to become massive in, say, 3 years' time. So something that's not obvious today, but you can see why it might be obvious to pharma in 3 years, which means, a new area of white space in biology. It might be difficult to drug, but I think, if you have awesome people around it, you can crack it. And, something that's not incremental, but also something that's not crazy, because I've never worked in a venture fund that has like a bottomless pit of money. So there's a sort of sweet spot from my mind of something that is potentially groundbreaking within sort of 3 years. That's a white space of biology, and that can be funded for, say $50 to $100 million.
Right. So you're interested in disruptive concept. And it sounded like Magnus was interested in that as well, something that adds adjacencies to the AstraZeneca pipeline when looking at companies. Is that correct?
I think we need both. I mean, BD from a big portfolio, you have a tactical aspect of this, and that is portfolio refinement based on reality. And then you have the long-term strategic direction that you need to work with partnership to sort out, and they are slightly different. And I think the problem to me is that, any industry, cash flow is key. And to invest in obscure technologies is not really associated with an immediate cash flow. So you need to complement these two, Horizon 1 versus Horizon 2 and 3. And I think we need to be in both spaces, but it's not one question. Right. It's dependent on what approach you're taking. We need both late, early, and exploratory science come from the outside. It's the balance between those and the fact that they need different mechanisms.
Yeah, I would totally agree with that from our perspective. I mean, it's a whole spectrum of kind of innovation that we're looking for and that needs to come through. So I totally agree with what Magnus has said there.
Wonderful. So if I try and summarize all of this for our participant that asked the question, we're looking for great disruptive science, founders who recognize their role in creating a great team that fits into a balanced portfolio with what industry needs, and with, at least with Jonathan, something extremely disruptive that can absorb a lot of capital and then change and then have a big market. So, but within there, there's a lot to work with. So thank you all for that feedback. So we have a question around IP structures. So the background here is that for the audience, in some of the Scandinavian countries, Denmark and Norway, the university owns the IP created at universities. In Sweden, there is professor's privilege, so professors own their own IP and then enter into relationships with university-held companies that help them advance that IP. And I want to pick up on something Jonathan said previously around the tech transfer versus investor mentality. And maybe I'll ask you, Clementina, about what is your approach to thinking about IP, and have you noticed any differences, pros or cons, with the professor's privilege versus having maybe your office run the IP?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. I mean, we've been talking about this subject for more than 20 years and we're seeing Denmark changing and everyone else in the world looking at us as well. I would say that I think it's a good way that we do have it today, but of course we're open to changing it. We think it's very important that the founders or the ID providers, the researchers, they have themselves that sort of a champion status, as well as the motivation and the drive they want to do something with it. Because as soon as we look at a project, we're interested to see, do they have the funding within the research field to actually accelerate that, and not just doing studies maybe they thought they wanted to do, but also studies that we think the commercial side want them to do. That's one part of it. But then, of course, the teacher's exemption in Sweden means that a lot of people are not interested in doing anything. So the Swedish state has actually thought that, we can give the holding companies connected to the universities a special fund to just take out those ideas that everyone has in their drawers. We work with this. We don't have that much resources, but we always say that we try to persuade the researchers to also tag along, because we will need them in the future. And we also connect them with other champions. So I would like to add that it's also important that we don't just have one IP to focus on and this professor. We connect them to somebody in Greece or India or in the US, and we get to bundle stuff. And we see also a big interest from the US VCs wanting to buying out and bundling very early IP. Okay, interesting. But if maybe one thing you mentioned I thought was interesting was the founder role in the own IP development. And maybe I'll comment regarding tech transfer and the Danish market, which is the tech transfer offices at universities hold the IP. That is not necessarily a guarantee that things are going to get developed, because it is very much an obligation the university has to process and pay for the IP, but it still requires a professor or a founder absolutely dedicated to having something happen. Mm-hmm. The whole process starts with scientists wanting to start the journey, which is key. One of the things we do with the BII is we try and take that IP and put it in a commercialization framework, because we find that when you have the founders owning the company with a license to the IP in the context of an accelerator like ours or like yours, there's more firepower behind around commercializing. In that sort of setting, we are more the drivers. So we both look them up and wake them up, sort of, if they're not already on this mission. And many of them are. The best ideas actually have come from researchers that are very active themselves. But just like you said, to help them to come in with another perspective and a commercial drive is very important.
So Clementina, may I ask you, I mean, this is to some extent a bit sensitive in Sweden because there's so strong opinions about it, but I think one observation I have made is that if you look on countries where there is a split of value between inventor, that's how it in reality works, even if you don't have the teacher's exemption. But I think that what worries me is to what extent there is no incentives for universities to engage in translation, because they don't get any, there are no incentives for them to
but I guess,
that.
Magnus, they do, because all the funding depends on, nowadays anyway, that the research funding institutions actually have some sort of a translation result to back it with. So when you look for research funding, many of the research funders, they want to fill out, what are you going to do with this in the future? What type of budget do you need to commercialize it? And I guess that maybe some are even more interested than others. For instance, the strategic fund, they actually give researchers 5 million crowns to start the commercialization or the evaluation process for the commercialization.
Yeah, I know they can get funding, but it's very different when it comes to engagement. I think, because it's basically prohibited for the university to engage in supporting the company. So
that's right.
And another aspect of this, which I think is interesting, is also, and this doesn't really matter so much today in life science, but if you look in the IT sphere, a lot of states, and not necessarily the nice ones, have to use exemption to extract innovation out of Sweden, because it's solely controlled by the inventor. And that's, it worries me a bit, to be frank.
So you're thinking maybe you don't get best practice across the IP portfolio. Okay, thank you for the comments. I think hopefully that answered our participants' question. We're nearing the end of our time, so what I'd like to do is ask one simple question to all of our participants to sort of round off. And the question I'd like to ask is, maybe what is your number one suggestion of something that we as an industry can do better in translating science into products, into companies that actually help people and get out there and help our ecosystem. So maybe I'll start with you, Richard, and ask you what you think.
I think the key to me is kind of engaging early with as many kind of experts as possible, really. So if you're in academia or in an early stage company, I think reaching out to pharma, reaching out to VCs, partaking in conferences, all these kind of things, just to kind of really get a sense of what the best way forward is, what kinds of other expertise, help, funding, etc. is out there. So for me, it's all about going out and talking to people, I would say.
Wonderful. All right, early engagement again. I like that. Jonathan?
I think if you are an academic innovator, probably developing a close relationship with an entrepreneurial manager who can work with you to really start a company before engaging with investors.
Okay, so building out your team with experienced people. That's excellent. Clementina?
I would say that I think it's important, the sort of panel discussions we have today, to sort of talk through what type of regulations or what type of collaborations or what else could we do to make it more simple. We have these perceptions that this is how it works, but maybe actually doesn't. Maybe it's very historical questions, or maybe we have other challenges that we need to focus on. So I guess that we need to more talk to each other in this field to make it better together.
Okay, so more cross region geography platforms.
Yeah, cross sector as well as cross phase, in what type of phase you're working.
Very good, thank you. Magnus?
How much time do I have?
Just one, Magnus. One.
No, I think if you look, if we put the patient in the center, I think that the needs among I mean, those who needs our product is changing. So I think the role, one very important aspect which we seldom talk about is the fact how we need to interact with both patients and healthcare providers in defining the needs of tomorrow. So I would like to see more of engagement of the patient and the healthcare providers in defining innovation, because we can't have an arm's length distance between what we do and what takes place in the clinic in the end. So that's one aspect where I think we can improve. The other part is about the way we are redefining innovation. Innovation is no longer what happens in a test tube or in a clinic. It's even about innovation in logistics in pharma. It's innovation in business models. And I think we as business developer, or whatever we choose to call ourselves, needs to think outside the box as well. Because the products of tomorrow will be about integrating what we do with other type of technologies. And that opens up for a very interesting dynamic when it comes to non-competitive collaborations, which I think is totally underexplored. And it's a very different way of thinking.
Wonderful. Okay, thank you so much. So I'll wrap up here and say, my number one suggestion is that I do believe there's really a lot of untapped potential in the Scandinavian markets regarding all the science that's being produced and the companies that are coming out of it. So I think there's a lot of work to do in bringing that forward, and that the number one thing we can do is sort of, and I think this is the approach we've tried to take here, is take an exit-led approach. Start with the end in mind and build it from there, and build the structures in place so that they achieve those ends. And then hopefully we'll be good at translating things together. Thank you so much, everyone, for participating. I'm going to say thank you to our participants for their questions as well. And with that, I'll hand over to Josh.
Thank you so much, Bobby. And yeah, let me reiterate those thanks. I thought it was a fascinating panel, lots of engagement as well on the platform and questions coming through. So clearly a front of mind issue for a lot of people, and a really fantastic panel of people sharing their opinions from different sides. So huge thank you to Jonathan, to Clementina, to Magnus, to Richard, and indeed for Bobby for hosting us and guiding through the presentation. A number of the BII companies are part of our company showcases as well. So if you haven't yet, please do check out the company showcases tab. You'll see a number of those exciting companies coming out of the BII, amongst others, that you can see their sort of pitch and their new technology that they're promoting. So our next session is actually an interactive one. It's on biotech valuations. So in your main agenda tab, if you click into the session, then a reminder, you do need to click the link that says join the masterclass. That will take you into the Zoom meeting. So that's an interactive session, camera on, and people sort of interacting and engaging around that topic, just as a reminder there. So hopefully see you all in about 7 minutes time on the next session.